Well, g'day and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I want to share with you the one major thing a lot of people grossly underestimate when they upgrade to new gear. I'm going to explain exactly what that is whilst taking lots of photos with lots of different gear. So when we start in wildlife photography, like I did, I was using a 70-200 lens, but I quickly discovered this was just too short for wildlife photography. I wanted more focal length to make that subject bigger. So what do? Inevitably, we go online and we have a look, and the majority of people settle on a zoom lens like the Sony 200-600. 600mm is a lot of focal length that makes that subject way bigger. Nearly every brand has one of these types of zooms, and they are fantastic and I love them. But the big thing people underestimate is the combined weight of the camera and the lens. This combo here, pretty much 3 kilos. And that is quite heavy, especially to handhold all day long. And I've lost count the amount of people that have emailed me saying, Duade, I've bought this Sony, I've bought this Sigma, but it's just too heavy for me. I can't handhold it out in the field. What should I buy instead? To help you, I'm going to break it into 3 different tiers, and we'll talk about each one in detail. The first tier is our heavyweight tier. That's cameras and lenses that weigh over 3 kilos, like this big prime we have here. The middleweight tier is the cameras and lenses that weigh between 2 and 3 kilos, like the Sony kit. And then we have our lightweight tier, and that's all kits that weigh under 2 kilos, like our little 100-400 and R7 here. All right, so let's start with the heavyweight tier, and that's where you find our big primes. That's the 400, 500, and 600mm primes. They do weigh quite a lot. The newer ones are lighter, but this version here that I have, the lens on its own is around 3.4 kilos, which is quite heavy. If you were to add in a body to that, remember our old bodies, my old 1DX here, 1.5 kilos. So this combo here would be 5 kilos. That's a lot of weight to be carrying around, and that makes it very hard to handhold, and you often need a tripod or a monopod. The question is, why would anyone want such big and heavy gear? And ultimately, it's for the image quality and the speed of these lenses. These are some of the sharpest and fastest and best image quality that money can buy, and that's why these lenses are so expensive. I absolutely love this lens. I've had it for probably close to 10 years, and it's my go-to if I want the very best image quality. I actually went for a morning walk recently and I spotted a wedge-tailed eagle in a dead tree. I walked back to the house. I've got this exact kit here, the R5 500mm lens and 1.4 converter. So we're looking at 700mm 5.6. I've walked up the hill and I've managed to handhold looking at the wedge-tailed eagle and rattled off a number of frames, and I managed to get this shot here with the leg outstretched, and I absolutely love this shot. The detail is absolutely superb. Even though we didn't have direct light, the Canon R5 has performed very well, and I'm very happy with that shot. It's such a beautiful species, and that was just handheld, spur of the moment, took the shot, which is great. I went out recently and I found some wood ducks on some grass, and I took out the 500. I sort of laid down, took some shots, and it's not going to win any awards, but the detail that you get is just absolutely superb, and there's no complaints from me whatsoever about the quality I get from this gear. And what are the downsides to these big heavy lenses? Well, the first one is they're often very expensive. I know the new prime lenses are thousands of dollars. In Australia, they're sort of $20,000, which is the price of a small car. You can definitely get second-hand ones like I have here, the 500 f4 Mark II, but they're still worth quite a bit of money. The other downside is just their sheer size and weight. Like to handhold this combo, I can do it, but for very short periods of time. Majority of the time, I'm using a tripod or a monopod, and that just adds to the awkwardness, and you're just not as flexible. When things are happening, bird and flight and things, it's just much harder with such a heavy gear. So the other downside to these big prime lenses is we're stuck at a fixed focal length. We can't change our composition easily like we can on a zoom. We either have to walk backwards or we have to get closer. For example, I took a shot of this cockatoo with this prime lens, and the detail is fantastic. There's nothing wrong with it, but the shot is a bit boring. There's nothing special going on about it. So I just so happened to have my little 100-400 zoom lens with me. So I've pulled this out and I've zoomed out and I've taken a shot of that same cockatoo, but included more habitat, and I prefer this image because we could change the composition. With the prime, I simply couldn't do that. So that's the big weakness of these primes, is just be aware of that fixed focal length. So overall, if you want the very best image quality and money is no object, then clearly these big primes are a fantastic option. Just be aware of the weight and size, and of course your fixed focal length. All right, that leads us on to the second tier, the middleweight tier, by far the most popular tier in wildlife photography. That's where we find all of our zoom lenses like this 200 to 600, the 200-800 by Canon, Tamron, Sigma, etc. So the majority of these lenses weigh around 2 kilos. We add in a body on and we're getting close to 3 kilos. So it's still quite heavy, but nowhere near as big as those big primes. Now, one thing I need to mention, and it's often hidden in a lot of these specs when you're looking to buy cameras and lenses, is a lot of the manufacturers only list the weight of the lens without the lens hood and sometimes without the actual collar. And it can be very, very deceiving. I think the Nikon 800 6.3 lens, that beautiful big lens, I believe on its own it's listed as around 2.5 kilos, but the lens hood itself is about 400 grams. So it's actually closer to 3 kilos once you start using it. The Sony is also the same. I think on its own it's around 2.2 kilos. This hood around 200 grams. I know it doesn't sound a lot, but it all adds up. So it goes from sort of 2.2 kilos for the lens. We add the body, we're looking at around 3 kilos for this setup. So you need to be aware when you're buying a lens and a camera, you need to think about the working weight. That is the lens hood, the lens foot, the batteries, the memory cards, all combined can often weigh a little bit more than you anticipate. And I believe that's probably why a lot of people think, well, 2 kilos, that's fine. But once they actually get the kit and they start using it, they're going, oh, this is a lot heavier than I thought. So just be aware of that. Okay, let's talk about the pros of these kits. And clearly the biggest pro is our focal length. To get 600 millimeters to 200 millimeters is just an amazing range for wildlife. You can get so many varied compositions. It makes that subject much bigger in the frame than our smaller 200 millimeter lenses. And it's just wonderful. And I absolutely love this kit. Every time I use this Sony lens, it brings a smile to my face. And I took it out recently. I had an idea in my mind that I wanted to capture some backlit birds flying in the sky with the sun behind. And this was the perfect combo for that. So I've traveled to a local lake where I knew some cormorants come into roost on this island. I've positioned myself, the sun's coming down, these birds are flying in, and I'm actually started at 600 and I'm trying to capture these backlit birds, and it's just working wonderfully. Even though this is the old A7 IV, isn't the perfect wildlife camera, it still works well. It's got eye tracking, nothing wrong with this camera. The first image I capture, I've got this bird coming into land. It's got its landing gear out, its wings up. I quite like that. The second image was an actual bird flying just under the sun. Didn't quite work out how I wanted because the sun was just a little bit too bright. So I thought, why don't I actually zoom out to 200 and try and include some sun and some clouds and a bird. And that's exactly what I did. I'm hand holding, shooting. Sure enough, we got a cormorant coming just over the sun. It's now much wider and a different shot altogether, and I really like this shot. So it just goes to show in that short session that I had, I was able to capture lots of different shots. And I even captured this landscape shot with this 200 to 600 lens. So the flexibility is what makes these lenses so amazing. And they're just so much fun to use. So what are the downsides to these lenses? There's a couple. Often they're a little bit slower than those prime lenses, so we need to use higher ISO. Sometimes they're not quite as sharp, but these ones are pretty good now. And of course, they're just the size and the weight. This is 3 kilos. That's a lot to hand hold, and my arms definitely fatigue after using this in the field. You may, if you can't handle that weight, you're gonna have to get a monopod or a tripod, and that just makes it a lot less enjoyable out in the field if you're having to lug that around with you. The other downside is they lose focal length the closer you get to the subject. I've talked about this before, but this Sony lens is 600 millimeters, but really it's closer to sort of 550 or even less the closer you get to the subject. So your prime lens will always make that subject bigger at the same focal length. I know that's confusing, but it's just something you need to be aware of. Even this kit here can feel a little bit short to me, the 600 on the Sony. So just be aware of that even though it's a 600 millimeter lens, you may still feel like you need more reach. So overall, I think these are a wonderful lens for wildlife photography. They are often nice and sharp now. They give you a lot big zoom range, often a lot more affordable than our big primes. Every brand now has their own option, and I believe they're all really, really good. So if you can handle the weight and the size, I think these are a great option to upgrade to for wildlife photography. All right, that leads us on to our third tier, and that's our lightweight tier. That's all cameras and lenses that weigh less than 2 kilos. Like this RF 100 to 400, and I've got the Canon R7 here. This combo here, very, very light. I think this lens weighs around 650 grams. The body's about 600. So I think this entire kit around 1.3 kilos. So you can handhold this much, much easier than these other heavy kits. and it's not really an issue. You can walk through the bush and fire away, and that's just such a wonderful little lens. Now, I've done an entire review on this, and I know many of you have bought this lens. I think for its price and its size, it's absolutely fantastic. So this lens is a 400mm lens. However, because I'm using an APS-C crop sensor from Canon, the full frame equivalent is around 640mm. So the subject will actually be bigger on this kit than it will on this Sony kit. That's definitely one massive advantage to the APS-C and Micro Four Thirds bodies. So what I decided to do was go out into the field and try this kit out. Now, I actually did use a 1.4 converter, which made this a 560 f11 or 896mm full frame equivalent, which is quite a lot of focal length. And I went out, I had a lot of light, that's why I was able to do that. I had a pelican land nearby, and I zoomed actually out to 280mm just to include some more habitat. We took this photo, which I actually quite like. The detail's fine, and I wouldn't have been able to get that, say, on my big prime lens. It's because I'm using this zoom that we're able to get that more habitat in the shot, which is great. I also had a magpie lark land nearby. I've got this full frame headshot. Detail's great. So overall, it performed well. But I want to be honest, I did try some bird in flight, and I was actually pretty disappointed. When I'm doing bird in flight, obviously you need a higher shutter speed. And because I had the converter on, I just didn't have enough light, and the ISO was higher at 1600. And I got some really nice poses, but the detail was just lacking. So I think that, well, that is my fault. I shouldn't have been using that 1.4 converter for bird and flight because it just didn't work very well. So just a word of warning that if you do use those converters, sometimes with bird and flight, it just makes it too awkward and too hard to get the detail that you need. And the other major benefit to these is you can just have them in the car next to you or just nearby. So if something happens, you can just pull it out and take some shots. Much harder with this big kit that you got to pull out and set up and get going. And when I was driving home, I actually did notice the sun had already gone down, but I noticed some color in the sky. So I quickly pulled in and I noticed some cockatoos flying through the sky. So I've actually got this kit out and I'm just trying to track these cockatoos as they're flying through the sky. And I did manage to get this backlit shot of a cockatoo. I love the color in the background. We can tell it's a cockatoo. I would have loved the crest up, but I was happy to get that. And it was just easily done because I had this kit nearby. Now, another kit that falls into the lightweight kit, and it's been getting a lot of attention, are the Micro Four Thirds bodies from Panasonic and Olympus. This is, or OM Systems. This is the Olympus OM1, which is a wonderful camera. Now, this lens doesn't fit into the really light lenses. This is the 300 f4. This combo is still under 2 kilos, but it's definitely getting up there towards the 2 kilos. But this is a really nice sharp lens. The body, for its price, gives you a stack sensor. It's got really high frames per second, eye tracking. It's just a wonderful camera. I've gone to a local treatment plant and there's some swans on the water. I didn't actually want to lay down too close to the water. So all I did instead, because these kits are so light, I just simply pulled the LCD out on the back and I just held it down above the water, looking at the LCD, focus, and took this shot of this black swan. And I quite like it. It definitely works well. And it shows you how these light kits just make it much easier to, do the composition. I couldn't do that with my prime lens, not a chance. So that was definitely an advantage of this nice light kit. So I kept walking and I noticed some magpie geese, and they aren't that common down south here, but I know one location where they are. I don't have that many shots of them. So again, using this kit, I spotted one bird sitting in the reeds, got down low, taken some shots, and I just want to share with you how moving can drastically change your composition. Now, I'm always going on about get as low as you can, get as low as you can, and that's true the majority of the time. However, in this scenario, perhaps it isn't the right thing to do. So I've got down nice and low, I've taken a shot, and when I looked at it, I thought that background is a little bit messy, it's a little bit dark, it's kind of interfering with the bird, and I thought what would happen is if I raised it up a little bit so the background was the water and not the trees. So that's what I've done. I've raised it up and we took this shot. So for me, I think this is just a little bit less distracting than that first image, and it's only because I lifted it up. And then I thought, should I try and get a reflection? So I've actually, this isn't a zoom lens, so I had to walk backwards and I've raised it and I've composed it, and we had the reflection and took this shot. So we got 3 photos. This one here, whilst we have the reflection, I don't think it really works for me because it's just a bit too messy and there's a bit too much going on. But what it highlights is I was able to get 3 different looking shots from the exact same location with the same kit just by moving. So always remember that tip. Don't be afraid of moving left or right, up and down to change how your shot looks. But overall, the image quality was absolutely fantastic from this kit. Because it's a 300mm lens, it's actually a 600mm full frame equivalent on a full frame. So this here is actually the same as this Sony, and I can obviously add a 1.4 converter to this if I need to. So whilst this lens is a little bit heavy, you can get, I think, a 75 to 300 that weighs next to nothing, and it's a very, very, very light kit, and an option I know many of you do use. So overall, there's amazing options in each one of these tiers, and it all comes down to obviously your budget, the size, the weight, the focal length you need, and the style of shooting that you do. You need to make a decision, can I handle this weight? How do you know if you can handle that weight? Ideally, you need to borrow someone's gear, you need to rent the gear, go to a store and hold it. You just have to be aware of just how heavy these are, trying to hold them long term. Before you invest all that money, ideally you really need to determine whether it's right for you. If you can handle the gear, maybe a second-hand big prime lens like this will give you the image quality that you want. Perhaps you sit in hides all day, use a tripod, and that's fine. But if you're hiking around in the bush and just walking around, then maybe one of these lighter kits will be better suited to you. I just want you to be aware of it, think about it, and then try and make your decision based on that. And what I would absolutely love is if in the comments you can share which tier you chose, which camera and lens you went with, why, what are the pros and cons, is weight an issue for you, what's helped you in your decision making process. I want our comments in this video to be a resource for everybody looking to buy a camera and lens, and we can share and learn off one another. So I will greatly appreciate anyone who puts a comment down there. If you've enjoyed this video, obviously give it the thumbs up, share with me your thoughts. Until the next video, happy birding, take care, and see you later.